A single German Tiger tank sat hull down behind a hedgerow near Villers-Bocage in June 1944, its commander scanning the horizon through his periscope, confident that no Allied tank could touch him at this range. And then a flash erupted from a Sherman nearly 1,200 meters away. And before he could register what happened, his Tiger's frontal armor split open like paper, and the entire crew compartment turned into a screaming inferno of molten metal and burning flesh. This is the story of how Germany's most feared tanks met their match, and it starts with one of the biggest lies of World War II. The Sherman wasn't weak. It was a calculated masterpiece of industrial warfare that the Germans completely misunderstood until it was far too late. And by the time they realized their mistake, thousands of their best crews were already dead. Let me take you back to the dusty fields of Normandy where this nightmare began for the Wehrmacht, because what happened there changed tank warfare forever, and the Germans never saw it coming. In early 1944, German panzer commanders had every reason to feel invincible. Their Tigers and Panthers dominated every battlefield they entered, and the standard M4 Sherman seemed like a joke by comparison. A Tiger, I mounted the feared 88mm KBDOK 36 gun, could engage targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters and wore frontal armor up to 100 millimeters thick that could shrug off most Allied anti-tank weapons. The Panther was even more terrifying in some ways, combining heavy armor with excellent mobility and a high-velocity 75mm gun that could penetrate any Allied tank from distances that left the Americans helpless to return fire. German crews had seen Shermans brew up. That's what they called it when a tank caught fire so fast the turret blew off. Dozens of times in Italy and North Africa, they watched American tank battalions get chewed apart trying to cross open ground. They counted kills in the double digits during single engagements. The nickname Ronson spread through German tank units, referring to the lighter company's slogan, "Lights first time, every time," because Shermans seemed to explode into flames the moment a German shell connected. Panzer crews shared stories in their bivouacs, laughing about how 5 or 6 Shermans would rush a single Tiger, and the Tiger would methodically destroy them all before they got close enough to do any damage. From the German perspective, it looked like the Americans had showed up to a modern war with outdated equipment and were paying for it with mountains of burning scrap metal and charred bodies. But here's what those German crews didn't understand about American tank doctrine, and this ignorance would cost them dearly in the coming months. The Sherman wasn't designed to fight other tanks as its primary mission. That sounds insane to anyone who thinks about tank warfare in terms of the Eastern Front's massive armor clashes, but the American Combined Arms approach worked completely differently. The Sherman was built to support infantry, break through defensive lines, exploit breakthroughs, and maintain operational tempo across entire theaters of war. When American forces encountered enemy armor, the doctrine called for tank destroyers, not tanks, to handle the threat. The M10 and later M36 tank destroyers packed more powerful guns specifically for killing panzers, while Shermans focused on their actual job of supporting the advance. More importantly, and this is crucial to understanding why the Germans were so wrong in their assessment, the Sherman was designed for mass production and battlefield sustainability. A Tiger cost approximately 300,000 Reichsmarks and required thousands of man-hours to build using precision components and rare materials. Germany produced fewer than 1,400 Tiger Is during the entire war. Meanwhile, America cranked out nearly 50,000 Shermans, could ship them anywhere in the world, had spare parts stockpiled at every depot, and could replace losses faster than Germany could count their kills. When a Sherman got knocked out, another rolled up to replace it within hours or days. When a Tiger went down, that was often it for that unit's heavy tank support for weeks or months. The Germans had optimized for tactical superiority while completely ignoring strategic reality, and nowhere did this miscalculation become more apparent than in the narrow lanes and thick hedgerows of Normandy. After D-Day, German panzer divisions moved into position expecting to use their superior range and firepower to savage the Allied advance. The Bocage terrain of Normandy, with its ancient earthen walls covered in thick vegetation and centuries-old hedgerows dividing every field into a natural fortress, should have been a nightmare for attackers and a dream for defenders with superior weaponry. And at first, it absolutely was. American tank crews found themselves trapped in a claustrophobic maze where a Tiger or Panther could be waiting around any corner, and the first shot in these close-range ambushes almost always meant death for the Sherman crew. The Battle of Villers-Bocage in June 1944 demonstrated this problem horrifically when SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann's single Tiger destroyed or damaged approximately 14 tanks and 15 personnel carriers from the British 7th Armored Division in just 15 minutes. American crews in nearby sectors heard the stories and felt the same cold dread. How were they supposed to fight an enemy they couldn't hurt even when they got close enough to engage? Tank commanders started requesting transfers to infantry. Crews developed dark humor about their life expectancy. Some units suffered catastrophic casualties, losing entire companies in single engagements. But while German crews celebrated their kill ratios and congratulated themselves on their superior equipment, Allied engineers and commanders were working on a solution that would turn the tables completely. The British had been the first to truly understand the depth of the Tiger problem during the North African campaign. At the Battle of Medellin in March 1943, German Tigers had torn through British armor with such ease that it became clear a new weapon was desperately needed. British ordnance experts had been developing the 17-pounder anti-tank gun since 1942, and it was a monster of a weapon, capable of penetrating 140 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters using standard ammunition, and even more with specialized rounds. The problem was mounting this massive gun in a tank. The 17-pounder was huge, had tremendous recoil, and required significant internal space for its crew and ammunition. Initial attempts to mount it in British tank designs ran into serious problems with size, weight, and balance. Then someone had a brilliant idea that seemed almost too simple. The Sherman's turret ring, the circular opening where the turret sits on the hull, was actually quite large because American designers had wanted to future-proof the design for upgrades. With modifications to the turret bustle to extend it rearward, reinforcement of the turret ring assembly, a redesigned recoil system, and removal of the hull-mounted machine gun to save weight, British engineers found they could shoehorn the 17-pounder into a Sherman. They called it the Sherman Firefly. The first Fireflies reached British armored regiments in early 1944, just in time for the Normandy invasion, and the Germans had absolutely no idea what was about to hit them. From the outside, a Firefly looked almost identical to a standard Sherman. The most notable difference was the longer barrel, but in the chaos of combat, especially in the confined spaces of the Bocage, German tank commanders didn't immediately recognize what they were facing. That confusion lasted exactly as long as it took for the first Firefly to fire on a German heavy tank. The 17-pounder's armor-piercing, discarding sabot rounds could punch through a Tiger's frontal armor at ranges where the Tiger's crew felt completely safe. The Panther's sloped frontal armor, which had been nearly immune to standard Sherman fire, could be penetrated by a Firefly at combat distances. Suddenly, German heavy tanks were vulnerable, and their crews knew it. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Imagine being a Tiger commander who had grown accustomed to methodically destroying Shermans from distances where they couldn't effectively fight back. And then suddenly, without warning, your supposedly invincible tank shudders from an impact that penetrates your frontal plate and sends white-hot fragments of armor and penetrator rod scything through your crew compartment. Your loader's body disintegrates. Your gunner is screaming because his face is gone. The ammunition stored next to your position starts cooking off. You have maybe seconds to bail out before the whole tank becomes your crematorium. And the worst part, the thing that really terrified German crews once word spread through their units, was that they couldn't tell which Shermans were Fireflies until those Fireflies opened fire and killed them. British tactical doctrine maximized this advantage brilliantly. In a typical British tank troop of 4 Shermans, one would be a Firefly. The standard Shermans would advance or maneuver in ways that drew German attention and fire, while the Firefly hung back slightly, using its superior range and penetration to engage German armor. German crews couldn't simply target the Firefly first, because they often couldn't identify it until it was too late. Even when they learned to look for the longer barrel, combat conditions made quick identification difficult, and by the time they figured out which Sherman was the dangerous one, they were often already burning. British Firefly commanders became the hunters instead of the hunted. They learned to use terrain and positioning to maximize their range advantage. They coordinated with regular Shermans to create crossfires that gave German heavy tanks no safe angle. They shared intelligence about German tank positions and worked with infantry to set up ambushes in the narrow lanes where Tigers and Panthers couldn't maneuver effectively. The Battle of Normandy from June to August 1944 became a grinding attritional nightmare for German panzer divisions, and the Firefly played a crucial role in breaking their combat effectiveness. Take the experience of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, one of the most fanatical and well-equipped German units in Normandy. They entered the battle with over 100 operational tanks, including numerous Panthers, and they fought with suicidal determination. But British and Canadian units equipped with Fireflies systematically destroyed their armor despite the Germans' tactical and technical advantages in individual tank-versus-tank engagements. Every time the Hitlerjugend tried to launch a counterattack to drive the Allies back to the beaches, Fireflies tore through their Panthers at ranges the Germans thought were safe. When they tried to establish defensive positions to bleed the Allied advance, coordinated attacks by regular Shermans and Fireflies overwhelmed their positions. the division's panzer component was effectively destroyed by mid-August, reduced to a handful of operational tanks and a few dozen dispirited survivors who no longer believed their vehicles made them invincible. The effectiveness of the Firefly spread terror through German tank units at a visceral level that's hard to appreciate from historical distance. German tankers started to experience what American Sherman crews had felt for so long, that sickening vulnerability of knowing their armor might not save them, that the next corner might hide a gun that could kill them before they even knew it was there. After-action reports from surviving German crews show the psychological deterioration clearly. Commanders described their men hesitating before movements that used to be routine. Crews that had been aggressive and confident became cautious and defensive. The kill ratio statistics that had favored German armor so heavily began to shift as German tanks became less willing to take the kinds of risks that had previously allowed them to dominate engagements. This wasn't cowardice. It was the rational response of men who suddenly realized they were no longer invincible, and that realization destroyed the combat effectiveness of German armored units as surely as the Firefly's 17-pounder rounds destroyed their tanks. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, because the Firefly was just the beginning of the Sherman's evolution, and the later variants would prove even more devastating to German armor. The Americans had been watching the development of the Firefly with great interest, and while they appreciated the British solution, they wanted something even better. American ordnance engineers had been working on the 76mm M1 gun, which offered significantly better armor penetration than the standard 75mm gun on early Shermans, while being easier to mount than the British 17-pounder. The 76mm Sherman started reaching American units in Normandy during July 1944, and while it couldn't quite match the Firefly's penetration at extreme ranges, it was more than capable of killing Panthers at normal combat distances and could reliably penetrate a Tiger's side or rear armor. More importantly, the Americans produced far more 76mm Shermans than the British produced Fireflies, which meant more American tanks could effectively engage German heavy armor instead of relying on one special tank per platoon. Then came the Sherman Jumbo, and this beast changed the game again in a completely different way. Some brilliant officer looked at the standard Sherman and asked a simple question that nobody had properly considered before. What if we just added more armor? The M4A3E2 assault tank, nicknamed the Jumbo, took the reliable Sherman platform and encased it in additional armor plates that brought its frontal protection up to over 150 millimeters in some places. Suddenly, you had a Sherman that could shrug off hits from German 75mm guns and even survive some shots from the feared 88mm at longer ranges. The Jumbo couldn't kill Panthers or Tigers at extreme range with its standard 75mm gun, but it didn't need to. It could absorb their shots while closing distance, drawing their fire while other Shermans flanked, or simply breaking through defensive positions that would have stopped regular Shermans cold. German crews faced yet another nightmarish variation: a Sherman that didn't die when they shot it. Imagine the psychological impact of firing your main gun at an approaching Sherman, watching your shot connect with a satisfying impact, and then watching in disbelief as that Sherman keeps coming without. even slowing down, closing the distance while your loader frantically tries to chamber another round, and you're suddenly aware that this thick Sherman is now close enough that the other regular Shermans around it can penetrate your side armor, and you're trapped in a position you can't easily retreat from because of the terrain or tactical situation. The jumbo didn't need to kill German heavy tanks directly. It broke their tactical advantage by surviving long enough to let other Allied weapons do the killing. The combined effect of Fireflies, 76 mm Shermans, jumbos, and continued production of standard Shermans created an operational nightmare for German forces that their tactical superiority couldn't overcome. Every engagement became a deadly guessing game. Which Shermans were dangerous at range? Which ones could survive your shots? How many were there, and how many more were coming up behind them? German crews couldn't simply rely on their superior guns and armor anymore because the technological advantage had evaporated in several critical areas, and the numerical advantage had always belonged to the Allies. The exhaustion of constant combat against an enemy that could replace losses, and you couldn't begin to grind down even elite German units. Panzer divisions that should have been withdrawn and rebuilt were kept in the line because there were no replacements. Crews that needed rest and training for new equipment were thrown into combat with minimal preparation. Tanks that should have been repaired properly were patched with field expedients and sent back into battle. The Battle of Arracourt in September 1944 provided a perfect demonstration of how completely the dynamic had shifted. The German 5th Panzer Army launched a major counteroffensive against American forces in Lorraine, and on paper they should have had every advantage. They fielded over 200 tanks, including numerous Panthers, significantly outnumbering the American 4th Armored Division's available Shermans. The terrain was relatively open, which should have favored the Germans' superior range. Weather conditions were terrible with heavy fog and rain, which should have negated Allied air superiority. But the Americans had 76 mm Shermans now, and their crews had learned how to fight German armor effectively. Over a week of intense combat, the Germans lost over 200 tanks and assault guns, while the Americans lost fewer than 30 Shermans. That's not a typo. The Germans lost more than 6 times as many tanks, despite having superior equipment and choosing the time and place of the attack. What happened? American crews used superior tactics, better coordination with infantry and artillery, excellent intelligence about German movements, and the fact that their 76 mm guns could now kill Panthers reliably at combat ranges. The Germans' technical advantage wasn't enough to overcome the Americans' advantages in logistics, combined arms coordination, and the simple fact that American tank crews no longer felt outclassed by German armor. Let's talk about specific Firefly commanders who became legends for their tiger hunting abilities, because these stories illustrate just how thoroughly the tables had turned. Sergeant Harris of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry knocked out 3 Panthers in a single engagement near Villers-Bocage, including one at a range of nearly 1,500 meters that the German crew didn't even think was dangerous. Lieutenant John Gorman of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry destroyed 4 German tanks in one day during the advance toward Caen, including a Tiger that had been terrorizing British infantry for hours. The citation for his military cross specifically mentioned his aggressive use of superior range and exceptional gunnery, which is military speak for "this maniac deliberately hunted tigers and won." Trooper Joe Ekins of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry achieved something even more remarkable on August 8, 1944, during Operation Totalize. His Firefly destroyed 3 Tigers in quick succession at ranges exceeding 800 meters, including the tank of SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, the same Tiger ace who had caused such carnage at Villers-Bocage months earlier. Wittmann, who had survived hundreds of engagements on the Eastern Front and in Normandy, and who was credited with over 130 tank kills, died instantly when Ekins's 17-pounder round penetrated his Tiger's turret. The Germans' most feared tank ace killed by an upgraded Sherman variant that German propaganda had dismissed as inferior. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The technical evolution didn't stop there either, because American engineering and production capacity meant the Sherman platform kept improving even as the war continued. The M4A3E8, called the Easy 8, combined the 76mm gun with improved suspension, better tracks, and mechanical refinements that made it more reliable and easier to maintain than earlier Shermans. The Easy 8 wasn't just a better tank, it represented something more important. The Americans had learned from combat experience and implemented improvements faster than the Germans could respond. While German factories struggled to produce enough Tigers and Panthers with increasingly scarce resources and under constant Allied bombing, American factories churned out Easy 8s by the thousands. While German crews learned to dread the sound of approaching Shermans, American crews gained confidence that their vehicles could win fights against supposedly superior German armor. The psychological shift was complete. The hunters had become the hunted. By the time of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the German High Command's desperation showed clearly in their tactics. The Ardennes offensive was Germany's last major attack in the West, and it involved virtually all remaining German armor reserves, including the cream of their panzer divisions. The Germans still had Tigers, still had Panthers, and in some cases they even had a few King Tigers, the massive Tiger II tanks with armor so thick that only a handful of Allied weapons could penetrate them from the front. On paper, this concentration of German armor should have been devastating. In practice, it demonstrated how completely the Sherman's evolution and American tactical improvements had negated Germany's technical advantages. When the weather cleared and allowed Allied air power to operate, German armor got savaged from above. When fighting moved to actual tank-versus-tank engagements, American tank destroyers with 76mm and 90mm guns tore through German formations, and Shermans, both Fireflies with British units and 76 militative variants with American forces, proved more than capable of killing German heavy tanks when conditions allowed proper engagement. The Germans' fuel shortages meant their heavy tanks often became immobilized targets rather than mobile threats. Their lack of spare parts meant that tanks damaged in combat often had to be abandoned even when they could have been repaired. Their exhausted, poorly trained replacement crews lacked the skill to use their vehicles' advantages effectively. The Battle of the Bulge showed that having superior individual tanks meant nothing when you couldn't fuel them, couldn't maintain them, couldn't replace them, and couldn't train crews to use them properly. Let's address something important that often gets lost in discussions about Sherman versus Tiger combat effectiveness, and that's the fundamental misunderstanding of what tank warfare actually required in World War II. German doctrine evolved on the Eastern Front, where massive tank battles involving hundreds of vehicles on each side were relatively common. In that environment, having the longest range gun and thickest armor made perfect sense because engagements often happened at extended distances across open terrain. But the Western Front after D-Day rarely resembled the Eastern Front's vast spaces. Combat in Italy meant mountains and narrow valleys where range advantages disappeared. Combat in Normandy meant hedgerows and small fields where ambushes happened at ranges under 500 meters. Combat in German cities during the final months meant street fighting where a Panzerfaust in the hands of a desperate Volkssturm soldier was more dangerous than any tank. The Sherman's reliability, mechanical simplicity, ease of repair, and adequate armor and firepower for close-range combat made it actually more effective in these conditions than Tigers or Panthers that were over-engineered for a different type of warfare. German crews found that their superior range meant nothing when they couldn't see targets beyond 100 meters. Their thick armor meant nothing when American infantry could maneuver close enough to attack their vulnerable spots. Their powerful guns meant nothing when mechanical breakdowns left them immobilized. The production numbers tell a story that German tankers couldn't escape, no matter how skilled they were or how superior their equipment appeared on paper. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks during the entire war at enormous cost in resources and industrial capacity. America built 50,000 Shermans and could have built more if needed. Think about what that means in practical terms on the battlefield. A German panzer division might destroy 50 Shermans in a month of heavy combat, and the Americans would replace all 50 within weeks and have spare parts, replacement crews, and additional tanks standing by. That same German division might lose 10 Panthers in that month, and those losses would be catastrophic because replacements weren't coming, spare parts were scarce, and trained replacement crews barely existed by 1944. The Germans were fighting an industrial war with a craftsman's mindset, building small numbers of extremely complex vehicles that required highly trained crews and extensive maintenance. The Americans were fighting an industrial war with an industrial mindset, building huge numbers of adequately capable vehicles that could be operated by adequately trained crews and maintained by mechanics with standard tools. Guess which approach worked better when you're trying to fight your way across an entire continent against an enemy who owns most of the world's industrial capacity? There's a myth that needs to be crushed here, and that's the idea that American tankers won through sheer numbers while suffering horrific casualties against superior German equipment. Yes, American tank losses were significant. Yes, Sherman crews faced real dangers, and many brave men died in burning tanks. But the actual casualty rates don't support the narrative that Shermans were death traps or that crews were sacrificed pointlessly. The Sherman actually had better crew survivability than many other tanks of the war, including some German designs, because the large hatches and spacious interior meant crews could bail out quickly when their tank was hit. The Ronson nickname was British dark humor, not an accurate description of the Sherman's actual fire risk, which was comparable to or better than other tanks once the Americans implemented wet stowage for ammunition. And American tank crewmen's casualty rates, while certainly not low, were significantly better than infantry casualty rates and much better than the catastrophic losses suffered by German tank crews in the war's final year. when they were fighting without air cover, without adequate fuel, without spare parts, and without realistic hope of victory. By 1945, being a German tanker was practically a death sentence, not because Allied tanks were superior, but because the entire German military machine was collapsing and taking its crews down with it. The final months of the war in Europe showed just how completely the narrative had reversed from those early days when German crews mocked the Sherman. American and British armored columns raced across Germany, meeting increasingly desperate resistance from a German military that could barely field cohesive units, let alone effective armored formations. When Allied tank units encountered German armor, the engagements were often pathetically one-sided because German tanks were immobilized by lack of fuel, crewed by teenagers with minimal training, or simply abandoned because there were no spare parts to fix mechanical problems. The few remaining veteran German crews fought with the same skill and determination they'd always shown, but skill and determination couldn't overcome the comprehensive collapse of their logistics, their industrial base, their training system, and their strategic position. Shermans that had once been dismissed as inferior now roamed across Germany, virtually unopposed by the armor that was supposed to stop them. Fireflies that German crews had learned to fear with good reason no longer faced the Tigers and Panthers they'd been designed to kill because so few German heavy tanks remained operational. The Easy Eights that represented America's late-war refinement of the Sherman design often spent more time providing infantry support and fighting bypassed German positions than engaging in actual tank-versus-tank combat because German armor had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The story of the Sherman versus the Tiger is really a story about industrial warfare, strategic vision, and the difference between tactical excellence and strategic success. Germany built superior individual tanks, trained excellent crews, and developed effective tactical doctrine for armored warfare. They absolutely dominated early tank-versus-tank engagements, and their crews had every reason to feel confident in their equipment superiority. But they fundamentally misunderstood what World War II required for victory. Building 1,000 Tigers that could each kill 10 Shermans sounds impressive until you realize the Americans could build 10,000 Shermans and would still win through sheer persistence and replacement capacity. Training elite panzer crews to high standards sounds impressive until you realize that dead elite crews can't be quickly replaced, while the Americans were training adequate crews in massive numbers. Mounting an 88mm gun that could kill at 2,000 meters sounds impressive until you realize most combat happened at ranges under 500 meters, where a 75mm or 76mm gun worked just fine. The Germans optimized for winning battles. The Americans optimized for winning the war. And when the Sherman's various upgraded versions proved they could actually kill Tigers and Panthers reliably, the Germans' entire strategic calculation collapsed because they had no answer to an enemy that could match them tactically while overwhelming them strategically. The Sherman Firefly didn't win World War II by itself. No single weapon system ever does. But it represented something crucial to the Allied victory: the ability to identify a problem, develop a solution, implement that solution at scale, and maintain the industrial and logistical capacity to keep improving even while fighting across multiple continents. When German crews stopped laughing at the Sherman and started dying to it, that shift marked the moment when Germany's defeat became not just inevitable, but imminent. The Tiger might have been the better tank in abstract technical terms. The Sherman was the better tank for actually winning the war that was being fought. And in the end, that's the only metric that mattered. Thousands of burned-out Tigers and Panthers scattered across Europe proved which approach was right, and the German tankers who had once mocked the Sherman learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Their laughter died in the flames of their supposedly invincible tanks, killed by the weapons they'd dismissed as inferior, crewed by men they'd underestimated, serving a strategic vision they'd never understood. That's the real story of how the Sherman burned the Tigers, and it's a lesson about warfare that remains relevant to this day. Technical superiority means nothing without the industrial base, logistical network, and strategic planning to support it. The Germans learned that lesson too late. Their crews paid the price, and the Shermans rolled on. If you want to see how the Pacific Theater played out with completely different challenges, check out the next video.